invite you to ponder quietly what characteristics make for a good father. On this Father's Day, seems like an appropriate question. What characteristics make for a good father? Ponder that. How about, in general, a good parent? How about the characteristics of a good person? I'm wondering if internally your answers were the same or different, depending on which way you were pondering that question. About 25 years ago, was with a Bible study group, and we had been talking about Father, and it had come up because there are people asking in the Bible when Jesus, there's lots of images and ideas for God that are beyond gender and use different genders, but one of the ways Jesus addresses God is Father, and so well, what does he mean by that, and why would he use that? And so as a way to enter into the conversation, I invited this group of people, meeting on a weekday morning, all of them retirees, and this is 25 years ago retirees, to first talk about what they believe are the good characteristics of a father. And I will tell you that most of those people, that's the generation that you saw on TV with the D-Day celebration. Those folks. These are people who were young adults, Great Depression, World War II. And so it was also just going to be interesting to me to hear how they would talk about that. So I start writing down on this whiteboard the things that they're saying. And most of the responses would fall under the category of protection and provision. A good father protects and provides. There were a couple people who said things around teaching, especially a father teaching a son. And one person said, teach a son how to be a man. And there were a few more responses, although kind of within those general umbrellas. And then it seemed they had finished, and I read back out loud the things that were on the board, because not everyone could see that board. And then I said a genuine thing that occurred to me. I said, it's interesting to me looking at this that no one used any form of the word love to describe the characteristics of a father. And I could tell, pondering quietly. And then one person offered, he said, well, I suppose if I think about my own father, that he provided and protected was the way he knew how to show love. He didn't say it. He really didn't show it affectionately, but that's how he loved, by providing and protecting. And then we talked about, well, what do you suppose God would see as the best characteristics of a father? And it was so interesting, all of them started talking about love. And it's the reminder to me in that conversation about there's ways that we are brought up, the time and places, the generations, our cultural expectations, that we have this way that we see the world, that we see things, that we expect things to be. And then there can be this way when we listen for how is God still speaking, that might expand our perspective or even turn it on its head. And we were seeing that in the reading from 1 Samuel, an example of that in the story. A little bit of the context, the background. In the story of the people Israel, God's initial idea, it seems, is that the people live in direct covenant connection with God and each other. There were some judges to help out when things got dicey, but otherwise, direct relationship, direct connection. But then the people, they were seeing other nations around them that seemed to have more power and more money, and the thing they noticed those other nations had that they didn't have was a king. And so they started asking, can we have a king? That'd be awesome. And then there's some response, and I'm paraphrasing, but God's saying, kings, you may think you want all that power and authority, but dictators aren't so great. They will take your money. They will make your children fight in wars. You're not in charge anymore. Are you sure you want that? And they're like, yep. And there really is, for me, this brilliant display of grace in that story where God says, okay, we'll meet them where they are. And so a first king is anointed, Saul. And Saul, in short, botches up the job. And so we come to the part of the story we heard today where God is saying it's time for a new king. We need a different king. And we see in the story God working through a prophet named Samuel. And a reminder that prophets are not, in the Bible, fortune tellers. They are people who are committed to listening for how God is still speaking and then sharing what they hear with other people. So that's what Samuel is doing. And this leads Samuel to the old little town of Bethlehem. How still we see thee lie. And as he comes there, and he's seen as this great prophet, you hear they're scared, like, oh my gosh, what's he doing here? And he's explaining, he's there making sacrifices, etc. But he's there to find the next king. And it's clear from the story that he understands the next king is to come from the family of a man named Jesse. And so there's Jesse and the boys at the sacrifice, at the celebration, and Samuel has a checklist of what he believes a king should be about. And in that time, that place, across the cultural lines, the sense of what makes for a good king is a big, burly warrior. And he sees the eldest son, Eliab, and we get a hint, standing head and shoulders above everyone else. All right, that's the tough guy. That's the one who will lead us in triumph over our enemies. He's going to be the king. But to his credit, Samuel stays open to the still speaking voice of God. And God says, against his expectations, that's not the one. All right, Jesse, that's not the one. And so then we see Father Jesse start parading the other boys right across for Samuel to get a look at them. And God is saying in his spirit, nope, not him, not him, not him. And then it seems we're out of sons. And a reasonable question that Samuel could have is, did I hear wrong? Right? Was it Bethel instead of Bethlehem? Am I in the wrong place? What's going on? But he thinks and says, Jesse, is this everybody? And we sense Jesse's hesitation. Well, there's one, the runt of the litter. I got him taking care of the sheep. Someone had to stay home. Which lets us know that Jesse also has a checklist of who is important and what is valuable. And David's not on it. Didn't even think it was worth bringing David to this place, to this time. Well, then David is brought forward from the field with the sheep. And then this is kind of a contradiction, it seems, in the story itself, where we hear God say, God does not look upon the appearances. And then we're actually given a description of the appearance of David. Right? You caught that? I heard some of you chuckle. He's ruddy, handsome, and with pretty eyes. And the Hebrew, no one's quite sure exactly what that means, but pretty eyes is maybe a good one. And what seems that's going on is, and we might miss it, but it's a contrasting description to the normal warrior look. And the way I think about it is that Eliab looks more like, if it was in our time and place, someone wearing Carhartt clothing, coming out of the hardware store, climbing into his Ford F-150. That's Eliab, looking tough, strong, burly. David is a doe-eyed Gen Z barista in Brooklyn who, at the coffee house in the evening, plays guitar songs of his own composition. That's kind of the feel. And so that's what we're getting captured in a way that we might miss. And so here's the picture where God's saying through Samuel, this is who I choose. This is who I believe can be the leader of the people. And that is turning all the expectations upside down. And so it's this really, for me, an important story, that reminder that we come into every situation, every circumstance with our experience, and our experiences can be valuable, but then we create these checklists and these expectations, and we then tend to live into those expectations, and we might miss something surprising and something better. And we get the same kind of idea in the parable that Jesus tells this morning. The parable of the mustard seed. Now, if you grew up in churches, how many of you ever were given a mustard plant or a mustard seed somewhere along the line? Right? Like, for Sunday school teachers, love this parable. Also because it's something tangible, right? Tangible. We can find a mustard seed for the kids. And so, on one level, we hear this parable. It's a parable about the reign of God, about how it works in God's way of seeing the world, God's systems, what was God's justice, what are relationships looking like in terms of how God would desire and dream them to be. So Jesus tells stories to help people get their minds around what he's inviting them into when he says, seek first the reign of God. What does it look like? What does it feel like? And so first, on one level, we get something that maybe reminds us a bit about Eliab and David. Because the mustard seed, the little thing, can become big. Right? Like little David can become the big king. Maybe. And there's some item of that fits. But there's more going on here. And one of the hints is that even though it says in the story the mustard seed is smallest, it's small, but it's not the smallest seed. And it doesn't grow into the biggest thing. So I think about, some of you have used at times the interpretation of the Bible written by Eugene Peterson called The Message. And Eugene Peterson is trying to account for this, and when he offers a contemporary retelling of this parable, he says, it is like a pine nut that grows into a great sequoia, right? The smallest becoming something giant. The mustard seed doesn't really cut it, which lets us know that Jesus has something else in view when he chooses the mustard seed. And remember, these parables are told in an agrarian society. These people get it about plants and life and how it works. And so they're probably picking up on this right away. I would miss it because I hear mustard seed and think, it's not my favorite thing on the hot dog, right? That's how I think of mustard. Well, they understand that the mustard is a weed. And it is a nasty, messy weed. Because the mustard could spring up along your field, and it grew up pretty quickly, and it was a woody shrub. So it's not a giant tree, a woody shrub. And some of you, I get some of those weeds here that if you let them go long enough are sort of woody, and then you're trying to pull them out of the cliche. Ugh, right? Hard to get those up. So not only that, but if they're growing and you don't notice it, well, now it attracts birds. Birds love the mustard. Birds eat the mustard, and guess what? Birds excrete mustard all over your field. And so it's particularly tenacious and messy. And so there's this picture. Jesus is saying the reign of God is like a tenacious weed that can take your well-ordered garden and transform the landscape. Maybe in ways initially you didn't want it to work that way. And so it's turning things upside down. So I'm thinking about a number of things in terms of following in the way of Jesus, or what the spiritual life looks like that could feel weedy. Because I think that's helpful to recognize that sometimes the way of God feels like something that we just want to pluck out because it made us uncomfortable or it's not what we are expecting. So I'm thinking about how in our culture, silence can be weedy. You may not be individually, but we are as a culture, we are a noisy culture. Everything has a soundtrack. Yes? I've been in many, many homes over the years, and often there's a TV just going all the time. Or I've gotten into a car being driven by someone somewhere, and even though we're going to talk, there's still the radio voices on, because the radio's just on all the time. And now, and that's like 15, 20 years ago I would notice this, and I remember when screens started to go into every restaurant. There was this little Chinese place in Connecticut I used to sometimes stop at in between meetings and just eat and have a moment to just be quiet, and then they put up screens everywhere. And so there was nowhere to get away. So it's not just, noise in ears, it's the noise visually too. There's just noise everywhere, noise on our phones. Noise, 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 noise. I'm thinking of the Grinch, right? The little pounding in his eardrums in that Stealing Christmas special. And so if we grew up with lots of sound, lots of visual input, lots of just constant, silence can be really uncomfortable. What happens if we actually are quiet? What might we feel? What might we notice in our bodies? What might we pay attention to our relationships? What might we catch on to in the world? Turn it up, right? It can become a way to soothe, but also to numb and to keep ourselves turned off. And so I think about, there's this constant in the Bible, this invitation to times of silence, be still. Moments of quiet, contemplation, meditation, and that can feel weedy and uncomfortable. I mean, partly trying to meet people where they are, and everyone's in different places. When we have our silence of listening in corporate worship, it is not more than a minute, because we do not want to drive anyone out of here screaming. And yet, there's this invitation that when we listen, when we make time and space for silence, we start to know ourselves. We open up better to invitations and images of God that can help us see differently, choose differently, live differently. But it can feel weedy and uncomfortable because it messes with the garden we already put in order. I've shared with some of you that my biological father would not have checked anyone's lists of what a good father should be. Alcoholic, abusive, and then abandoned our family for another woman. And wasn't even provider or protector because he resisted paying child support after he left my mom as a single mother. And I'm sharing that with you because a later point in my life, my mom remarried. And so from elementary school on, I had a pretty good dad. Happy Father's Day. And he's still who I call dad, and my son thinks of as grandfather. But there was this gap in these early years where essentially there was either really bad fathering or no fathering. And so when I was approaching the time of becoming a father, I'm meeting with a spiritual director, and I realize I start to feel really afraid. And I say to him, I'm afraid I'm going to mess my kid up. I don't know how to do these early years. I have no model of it, not a good one anyway. And my spiritual director said to me, well, the fact that that's your concern probably will help you do better already. But we talked some more about that, and he reminded me I don't need to be afraid. And he encouraged me, he said, keep doing the things that help you stay connected with God and yourself. And it's going to get harder because everything's going to change when you have a kid. So already you might feel like the calendar's full, life is full. Well, sleepless nights, eventually coaching, transporting to plays and shows and dates, and oh my gosh. He said, so don't give up the times of centering and quiet. Commit yourself to those. Make sure you have room in that every day. It'll feel easy to I don't have time for this. Get up earlier. Do what you need to do. And I didn't do it perfectly, those practices, but I did it more than I would have without that advice. And I certainly did not parent perfectly. And I made plenty of mistakes. But a few years back, my son, at the time in his early 20s, was visiting me, and I asked him, actually remembering that Bible study conversation from 20-some years ago, before he was born. And I said, what would you say are the good characteristics of a father? And he said, and I wrote them down, and I got his permission that I could share this with other people. He said, someone who is open, always learning, and authentic to who they are. He said, for me, personally, someone who cares about me, if you're my father. And he said, someone who loves me without condition, even when I mess up. And I asked him, a little afraid, how'd I do? Oh, really well, Dad. That's how I know what makes for a good father. And it hit me, though, that what he said, those characteristics, that's also a good mother, a good parent, a good friend, a good political leader, a good person. And there are ways that we can tap into that goodness. And sometimes it feels weedy. Sometimes it might turn things upside down. But it's the way that helps us live into the fullness of love and to share it with others, no matter who we are or where we are in the journey. Jesus shows us the way. Come and see. Amen.